Hello friends, now we are continuing with the human reproductive system and now our topic is about oogenesis which is a part of gametogenesis. The process of formation of haploid ovum from diploid oogonia cells in the ovary is called oogenesis. This begins at embryonic development. So now we have the stages and we call the cells as initially we call it as oogonia, which is a gamete mother cell which is diploid in nature. At birth, many million in the fetal ovary are present. So, next, the stage is primary oocyte. Prophase 1 of the meiotic division. It is been locked, temporarily arrested in primary oocyte. So, now the primary follicle. The primary oocyte plus granulosa cell, we call it as primary follicle. Inside this only we have the primary oocyte. So, many follicles degenerate from birth to puberty. So, maximum around 60,000 to 80,000 in each ovary is present at the time of puberty, which is being arrested in prophase 1. Next, secondary follicles. The primary follicle surrounded by more granulosa cells and theca, means nothing but the layers, we call it as secondary follicles. Next, tertiary follicles. The secondary follicles will develop a fluid filled cavity which we call it as antrum. The theca layers are theca externa and theca interna. Theca interna is vascular and theca externa is fibrosus. So the theca interna, which is around 10 to 15 layers of the follicle cells, which is of membrane granulosa, the primary oocyte within the follicle, the size increases and the first meiotic division, unequal large haploid secondary oocyte plus first polar body is being developed. Next, secondary oocyte. The rich nutrient cytoplasm of the primary oocyte, the tertiary follicle into Graafian follicle. Now, the secondary oocyte with zona pellucida. This is the characteristic membrane of secondary oocyte. The Graafian follicle rupture and releases the ovum. So now in this picture it will be very clear about in detail explanation. So initially it is primary oocytes. So this primary oocytes will be locked in prophase 1. So later the development of the oocyte and the follicle. So this whole thing with the development of the granulosa cell along with the oocytes we call it as primary follicle. Now the continued the development of the primary follicle. So with development of more granulosa cells will be happen in the primary oocyte. Now from the primary oocyte, so around 60,000 to 80,000 of the primary oocyte will be present from the birth till the puberty. So till in the at the time of birth we have many millions. After that, so during birth we have, so till puberty many things will be disintegrated. Around 60 to 80,000 will be reminded. Now the primary oocyte will develop into secondary oocyte. So secondary oocyte later will develop into tertiary and Graafian follicle. Now the Graafian follicle will release the oocyte ovum by a process called ovulation. Now the ovum we call it as egg and the remnant of the Graafian follicle we call it as corpus luteum, which is nothing but yellow body which produces the progesterone during menstruation and even at the time of pregnancy also. Later the degenerated corpus luteum which we call it as corpus albicans, which is a white color. And next, so this is the diagram of mature follicle, nothing but Graafian follicle. So this in the center we have the ovum. This is the ovum and this is the antrum. And oogenesis. The process of the formation of haploid female gamete ovum in the follicle of the ovary we call it as oogenesis. Oogenesis starts during embryonic stage. So germinal epithelium of the ovary divides mitotically to produce millions of gamete mother cell or oogonia. No oogonia is formed or added after the birth. Oogonia enters into the meiosis 1. It proceeds to prophase 1, gets suspended and forms the primary oocyte. During puberty, the primary oocyte restarts its first meiotic division. So initially it is oogonium, undergoes several mitotic division in the embryonic stage itself and finally develop into oogonia. Later this there is no adding of any oogonia. It is been fixed number. But when it comes to spermatogonia, it is been we have the many million in numbers will be added. But here it is fixed. Later on the cell growth it will develop into primary oocyte and this primary oocyte only will be in prophase 1 arrested, and later the primary oocyte will undergo the first meiotic division and forms the secondary oocyte plus first polar body. We have the two cells, unequal cells. One is secondary oocyte, another one is first polar body. Later, the secondary oocyte will develop into tertiary follicle and Graafian follicle and will rupture. And later, the ovum and the second polar body will be divided only during the time of fertilization. If the fertilization is not happened, the ovum will be disintegrated in this stage only. So this division only will be happen. You have to remain again and again. I am telling this stage will be happen only when the sperm is coming into this ovum, penetrating during the time of penetrating only. The secondary oocyte will be developed, will be divided into ovum and second polar body. So oogenesis will takes place by three stages as follows: multiplicative phase, growth phase, and maturation phase. First, multiplication phase. Certain primary germ cells, which are large of nuclei of germinal epithelium, lines the ovary undergo rapid mitotic division. It results in the formation of group of diploid egg mother cells, which we call it as oogonia. Each group of cells forms a rounded mass of the cells called egg nest. So from the oogonium, it will undergo several mitotic divisions to form oogonia. So later, so we have already discussed in the previous one. And next, growth phase, which is a long duration, which is around 12 to 13 years. So the puberty time also will be at the age of 13 years. So during that phase, the growth will be keep on happening. One of the diploid oogonia undergo growth increases in the cytoplasm and accumulation of yolk and transformed into enlarged oogonia, which we call it as primary oocyte. Other oogonia from the single layered follicular epithelium or the primary follicle. Primary follicle surrounded by more granulosa cells, which we call it as secondary follicle. So secondary follicle is again with fluid filled antral cavity, antrum, which finally will develops into tertiary follicle. From the tertiary follicle only the Graafian follicle will get developed. So primary follicle, so primary oocyte, secondary oocyte. So from the secondary oocyte to tertiary follicle to Graafian follicle. Or we can also remind like primary follicle to secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, Graafian follicle. Maturation phase. A fully grown primary oocyte, which is diploid, undergo the first meiotic division. Means at the time of the puberty only, this first meiotic division will be happen. The first meiotic division will be happen and formation of two unequal haploid cells. So the large secondary oocyte and the small polocyte, which is a polar body, we also call it as. So the secondary oocyte undergoes second meiotic division to form a large ootid or ovum and second polar body. So the secondary oocyte forms a new membrane zona pellucida Graafian follicle. So the first polar body undergo an equal division to produce two cells. So this will undergo an equal division to produce the two cells. Next, during oogenesis, four cells are produced. Among them, one is functional, which we call it as ootid, and three are non-functional polar bodies. The ootid is with a very little change become an ovum. So we have the ovary. So in the ovary, we have the primary germ cell in the embryo, and later on differentiation, it will develop into oogonium. Oogonium on the mitotic division, it will develop into the primary oocyte. Next, completion of the meiosis 1 and the meiosis, it will develop into secondary oocyte and the first polar body. And now the secondary oocyte will be on ovulation. So ovulation means nothing but release of the secondary oocyte. Now after the entry of the sperm, which triggers the completion of second meiosis division. So the second meiosis, first meiosis will be happen at the time of puberty. So puberty and menstruation. And the second meiosis will be happen when the sperm is triggers and the completion of second meiosis. So this is oogonium in the ovary, primary oocyte within the follicle, the growing follicle and the mature follicle. So the mature follicle other name is Graafian follicle. Next, menstrual cycle. The reproductive cycle of the female primates, we call it as menstrual cycle. Menstruation is the term given by the periodic discharge of the blood, tissue fluid and mucus from the reproductive organs of sexually matured females. The flow usually lasts from 3 to 6 days each month and it is caused by sudden reduction in the hormone estrogen and progesterone. The menstrual cycle begins when the female reaches the age of the puberty. The first menstrual cycle begins at the puberty, which we call it as menarche. During the menstrual cycle, the uterus endometrium prepares itself for implantation of fertilized egg. If the fertilization does not occur, the uterus lining is shed from the body. So the menstrual cycle is repeated at an average interval of 28 days. One ovum is released in the middle, usually 14th day of each menstrual cycle. Coming to the menstrual cycle, we have the following phases. First phase, which we call it as menstrual phase or bleeding period. Next is follicular, before the egg is released. And ovulatory, when the egg is released. Luteal phase, after the egg is released. So these are the four phases in the menstrual cycle. So in this picture, we can able to see. So the first phase, second phase, third phase, and the fourth phase. So first phase will be with last for 1 to 5 days. So 1 to 5 days we call it as menstrual phase, and next is the 6 to 10 days is follicular period, and next 11th to 18th day is ovulatory period, and 19th to 28th day is luteal phase. So this is the developing follicle. This is FSH, means follicle stimulating hormone. Primary hormone levels, this graph will show. So the primary hormone levels will be normal, but at the time of ovulation phase, it will be increased. Follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. So release at the time of ovulation only. So developing follicle, mature follicle, nothing but Graafian follicle, which will release the ovum. And now at the corpus luteum phase, again it will suppress. Coming to the menstrual phase, which is a bleeding phase. It is the first phase of menstrual cycle, lasts for 3 to 5 days. Breakdown of endometrial lining and blood vessels will occur. It will leads to bleeding, comes out through the vagina. So it occurs only when the ovum releases and fertilization does not occur. The lack of menstruation is the indication of pregnancy. Follicular phase or the proliferative phase. It lasts around 1 to 14th days. So menstruation phase followed by the follicular phase. So primary follicle grows to Graafian follicle and endometrium regenerates and proliferation will occur. Gonadotropins, nothing but pituitary hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone increases and stimulate the follicular development. This in turn increases the estrogen secretion from the growing follicles. So luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone attain its peak in the middle of the cycle, that is in the 14th day. So the rapid secretion of luteinizing hormone, which we call it as luteinizing hormone surge, indicates the Graafian follicle rupture and releases the ovum, which we call it as ovulation. And the remnant of the Graafian follicle, we call it as corpus luteum. Next, luteal phase and the secretory phase. This phase will begins after ovulation. Ruptured Graafian follicle transformed into corpus luteum. It produces a large amount of progesterone, essential to maintain and proliferate the endometrium. Now, endometrium, necessary for implanted of fertilized egg and ovum, does not shed during pregnancy. If fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum grow and further and pregnancy will continues and the menstrual cycle will stop up. In the absence of the fertilization, the Graafian follicle will be transformed into a yellow body, which we call it as corpus luteum. So the progesterone level will decreases the corpus luteum and degenerates the corpus albicans. Decreasing in the progesterone levels leads to menstruation. So the menstrual cycle ceases at 50 years, which we call it as menopause. So the cyclic menstruation is the indicator of normal reproductive phase and extends between menarche and menopause, nothing but starting of the menstruation and ending of the menstruation. Next, fertilization and implantation. During copulation, which means coitus, semen is released by the penis into the vagina, which we call it as insemination. The motile sperms swim rapidly and pass through the cervix, enter into the uterus, and finally reaches the junction of the isthmus and ampulla. So, which is nothing but ampullary isthmus junction of the fallopian tube. Now, the fertilization is nothing but if the ovum and the sperms are transported simultaneously to the ampullatory isthmus junction, the process of fusion of sperm with an ovum, which we call it as fertilization. So the sperms contact the zona pellucida of the ovum, induces the changes in the membrane and that blocks the entry of other sperms. So acrosome of the sperm secretes the lytic enzymes, which is hyaluronidase, helps in the penetration into the ovum cytoplasm through zona pellucida and plasma membrane. So now, out of this hole, this is the sperm which is inducing the membranous changes to avoid the other sperms to reach. Now it is been penetrating the zona pellucida. From the zona pellucida, it is been entering into the corona radiata, and from corona radiata to it will enter into the ovum. So the meiotic division of the secondary oocyte after the sperm enters the plasma membrane of the ovum will start. So the secondary meiotic division will causes the secondary polar body and ovum or oocyte. So the nucleus of ovum plus sperm, which we call it as zygote. The sex of the baby is decided by this stage. Fusion of the sperm and ovum. So the sperm will be the acrosome will be, so in this phases you can able to see. So this is the acrosome, sperm, nucleus and acrosome. So in this phase, this is the acrosomal reaction. So we have the hyaluronidase enzyme. Now the penetration will leads to zona pellucida penetration, and finally it enters the cytoplasm. So this, after entering into the cytoplasm, it will stimulate the ovum secondary oocyte to undergo the second meiosis phase, and it will form the oocyte plus second polar body. So fertilization and passage of the growing embryo through fallopian tube. This is the whole process. Initially it is, so initially we have the secondary oocyte, and from the secondary oocyte the sperms will enter, and finally so it will undergo the division and fusion to form the zygote. After the zygote formation, it will develop into two-celled stage. From the two-celled to four-celled, from the four to eight, and finally it will form the morula, means ball of cells. So this part we call it as cleavage. Second cell stage, four-cell stage, and eight-cell stage. And next, formation of blastocyst, nothing but hollow. Next, implanted blastocyst into the uterus. This is the growing phase of the embryo. Sex determination. The sex of a baby is determined during fertilization and in the zygote. So the sex is determined by the sex chromosomes present in the zygote. The humans contain two sets of the chromosomes, autosomes and allosomes. So we also call it as sex chromosomes. Sex chromosome present in the human female is XX and male is XY. All the female gametes produced have 22 autosomes and only X chromosome. Sperms produced by male having 50% has 22 autosomes plus X, and 50% has 22 autosomes plus Y. So the fusion of sperm with Y chromosome with ovum results in male baby XY, and the fusion of sperm with X chromosome with ovum will result in the female baby XX. So the zygote carrying the XX chromosome will develop into female, and the zygote carrying XY chromosomes will develop into male. For example, in this picture it is been clearly shown. So 44 plus XY, we call it as male. 44 plus XX is female. From the female, only one single type of gametes will be coming. But from the male, we have 22 plus X and 22 plus Y. We have two types of gametes for 50-50 chances. So, when this 22 plus X and this 22 plus X got mixed, we will get a female. When this 22 plus Y and this 22 plus X we got mixed, we will get a male. So now the determining factor for the sex is male, not the female, because the female will produce the same type of gametes, but the male will produce different types of gametes. So cleavage. The zygote from the isthmus or the oviduct to the uterus, mitotic division, the first cleavage will happen in the first 36 hours. So second, 4, 8, 16 daughter cells, which we call it as blastomeres. Embryo with 8 to 16 blastomeres, we call it as morula. Morula, the division continues and the formation of hollow ball, which we call it as blastocyst. The blastomeres in the blastocyst arranged in two layers. An outer layer, which we call it as trophoblast, and the inner layer, we call it as inner cell mass. The trophoblast cells are attached to the endometrium. It helps in the implantation and the development of placenta. The inner cell mass get differentiated into embryo. The complete attachment of the blastocyst to the uterine endometrium, we call it as implantation. So now this is the egg and sperm, zygote, morula, blastocyst. This is the outer cell mass and inner cell mass. So now it will be implanted in the uterus. So this is the endometrial epithelium. This is the embryonic pole. This is the inner cell mass. These are the trophoblast. So the trophoblast only will get attached to the uterus. So these are the endometrial glands. We have the endometrial capillaries. Pregnancy and embryonic development. The chorionic villi, the finger-like projections on the trophoblast, the villi means finger-like projections surrounded by the maternal blood and the uterine tissue. So the villi and the uterine tissue interdigitated, means when you close your fingers with your other hand of the fingers, structural and functional unit between the fetus embryo and the maternal body is placenta. The inner cell mass, which forms the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, which forms the different organs. So the outer layer which will form the placenta, the inner layer will form the three germ layers. Functions of the placenta: helps in the nutrition of the embryo and transport the nutrients like amino acids, sugars, vitamins from maternal blood to fetal blood. Respiration of embryo, exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide through diffusion from the fetal blood to maternal blood or vice versa. Excretion, nitrogenous waste like urea into the maternal blood. Endocrine gland, estrogen, progesterone, human chorionic gonadotropin, and human placental lactogen are being produced, which acts like an endocrine gland also. Antibodies, diphtheria, smallpox, measles, etc., pass through fetus from the maternal blood, stores the glycogen till the liver functions. Effective barrier for toxic chemicals and germs. So this is the placental villi. So this is the umbilical cord with its vessels. And this is the cavity of the uterus. This whole thing is the cavity. Inside the cavity we have the embryo. So this is the embryo. Embryo, we have the umbilical cord, and this is the placental villi, and this is the plug of the mucus into the cervix, and this is the placenta. This attachment, which is the whole, is the placenta, and this is the endometrium. So in this picture also, it is clear about how the maternal arteries and veins are being connected with the fetal. So there is no any direct connection. So only the thing is, everything will be passed through diffusion only. There is no any direct physical connection with the maternal veins and the fetal veins or arteries. So later phases of the pregnancy, relaxin secreted by the ovary. So human chorionic gonadotropin, so HPL and relaxin only during pregnancy. Other hormones like estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, prolactin, and thyroxine increases the several fold in maternal blood. So hormones supporting the fetal growth, metabolic changes in the mother, and maintenance of the pregnancy. After implantation, the inner cell mass differentiates outer ectoderm and inner endoderm and middle mesoderm soon will appear, and the tissues, organs soon will be developed. Inner cell mass contain certain cells which we call it as stem cells. Potency to gives rise to all tissues and organs. Pregnancy will last for 9 months, which is being divided into 3 trimesters. First trimester, end of the third month. Second trimester, end of the sixth month. And third trimester, end of the ninth month. So first month, embryo heart is formed. First sign, listening the heart sound through stethoscope. Second month, limbs, digits, and end of the 12th week, first trimester, major organ systems, limbs, external genitalial organs will be developed. First movement and hair on the head during the 5th month. End of the 24th week, second trimester, body covered with fine hair, eyelids, separate eyelashes are being formed. End of the 9th month, fetus is been fully developed and ready for delivery. Next, parturition. So the period of pregnancy we call it as gestation period. It is 9 months in the humans. So the delivery of the fetus we call it as parturition. It occurs by contraction of uterine myometrium. The signal of the parturition is being originated from fully developed fetus and the placenta. It induces the mild contraction of the uterus, which we call it as fetal ejection reflex. The hormone, which is called as adrenal gland, secreted by the fetus, diffuses in the maternal blood and stimulate the oxytocin secretion. Oxytocin will causes the forceful contraction of myometrium, which induces the labor pain and stimulates the further secretion of oxytocin. Stimulates the reflex between the uterine contraction and oxytocin secretion. Continues inducing the stronger contraction and pushes the fetus by dilating the cervix and facilitated by relaxin parturition. So after delivery, the placenta is also expelled out of the uterus. Lactation. The mammary gland of the female undergo differentiation and produces the milk towards the end of the pregnancy, which we call it as lactation. The mammary gland starts producing the milk towards the end of the pregnancy. Milk produced during the initial days of lactation, we call it as colostrum. It contains the several antibodies which provides the immunity, which is a passive type of immunity or resistance to the newborn baby. The milk production is controlled by lactotropin or prolactin hormone secreted by the pituitary. So the breastfeeding during the initial period of infant growth is being recommended for bringing up of healthy baby. So I hope you enjoyed about this topic and it is somewhat more interesting also. Thank you very much. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe to my channel.